Welcome, friends. We're so glad to have you here. We've prepared some incredible stories that we hope you'll enjoy. If you do, and you'd like to support the channel and help it grow, please consider subscribing. Your support means the world to us. It was almost midnight, and I was running on fumes, both my car and my body. I had been driving for hours, heading back home after a weekend at my buddy's lake house, and I still had another 2 hours to go. The highway was dead, just a long, dark stretch of asphalt cutting through nowhere. Then, like a gift from the universe, I spotted a gas station up ahead. One of those old-school ones with a flickering neon sign and a single pump out front. I pulled in, killed the engine, and stretched. The place looked half abandoned. Just one old pickup parked at the side and a dim light glowing from inside. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped in. That's when I saw her. She was behind the counter, reading a magazine. Early 20s, dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, smacking on a piece of gum like she had all the time in the world. She looked up at me, her eyes sharp and calculating, and gave a slow, knowing smile. "Long drive?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, grabbing a soda from the fridge. "Just trying to stay awake." She popped her gum and nodded. "Yeah, you look beat. Where you headed?" I hesitated. It wasn't a weird question, but something about the way she asked it felt off. Too curious. "Home," I said vaguely. "That right?" She leaned against the counter, watching me. "Funny, don't see a lot of guys driving through this late." I shrugged, trying to shake the weird feeling creeping up my spine. "Guess I got lucky, finding this place open." She laughed, low and soft. "Yeah," she murmured, "lucky." I paid for my soda and stepped outside. The night air was thick and still, the only sound the buzzing of the flickering gas station sign. As I walked toward my car, I glanced back through the window. She was still watching me. I tried to brush it off. Just a weird gas station clerk, nothing more. But as I got back on the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced in my rearview mirror. Headlights. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another car on the highway. But then I realized the road was empty when I left the gas station. And those headlights, they weren't just behind me, they were following me. For the next 10 miles, the car stayed right on my tail, not passing, not falling back, just there. A low, creeping dread settled in my stomach. I pressed the gas a little. So did they. I switched lanes. So did they. That's when I knew this wasn't random. My pulse pounded as I gripped the wheel. I needed to lose them. I took the next exit, speeding down a back road that wound through the woods. No streetlights, no other cars, just darkness. The headlights followed. I pushed my old Honda as fast as it would go, but the car behind me was bigger, faster, gaining. Then, bam, they rammed me. My tires screeched as I fought to keep control. I swerved, barely missing a ditch. My heart slammed against my ribs. And then just ahead I saw it, a roadside diner still open. Bright lights, people inside. Safety. I swerved into the parking lot, tires screeching, and threw the car into park. The other car, it didn't stop. It slowed just enough for me to see the driver, and my stomach dropped. It was her, the girl from the gas station. She grinned at me through the windshield, chewing her gum, her eyes glinting in the neon light. Then she drove off into the night. I sat there shaking, staring after her taillights until they disappeared. Eventually, I went inside the diner, my hands still trembling as I ordered a coffee. The waitress must have noticed how pale I was. "You okay, hon?" she asked. I swallowed hard. Some girl, she followed me from that gas station down the highway, tried to run me off the road. The waitress frowned. "Gas station?" "Yeah," I said. "About 20 miles back, small place, single pump, girl working the counter, dark hair, chewing gum." Her face changed. "Sweetheart," she said slowly, "that station burned down last summer." I blinked. "What?" She nodded. "Guy who owned it locked up late one night and never made it home. They found his truck in a ditch but no sign of him. A week later, the place caught fire. No one's worked there since." A chill ran down my spine. "But my voice faltered. I had seen her, spoken to her. She had tried to kill me." The waitress gave me a long, knowing look. "Maybe you should stick around for a bit. Drink your coffee." I nodded, gripping the warm mug like it was the only real thing left in the world. I stayed at that diner for almost an hour, hands wrapped around my coffee cup, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The waitress kept giving me these cautious glances, like she wasn't sure if I was messing with her or if I was about to lose my mind. But I knew what I saw. The girl was real, and she had tried to run me off the road. When I finally left, I stuck to well-lit roads, checking my mirrors every few minutes, but she never came back. For a while, I thought maybe I'd gotten away. A week passed. I was back home, trying to shake off the whole thing, when it happened again. I was leaving work late one night when I saw it. That same car, parked across the street. Engine off, headlights dark, waiting. A cold wave of fear rolled through me. I didn't go to my car. Instead, I turned and walked straight back inside, heart hammering. My coworker, Jason, looked up from the register. Forget something? Yeah, I lied. Hey man, can you give me a ride home? He frowned. What about your car? I'll get it tomorrow, just please. Jason gave me a weird look, but he nodded. We left through the back door, slipping into his car without turning on the lights. I forced myself to keep my breathing steady as we pulled away from the parking lot. As we turned the corner, I risked one last glance. She was still sitting there, but now she was smiling, like she knew I was scared, like she liked it. That was the night I decided I was done being hunted. I wasn't going to wait for her to make the next move. I was going to find out who the hell she was. The next day, I drove back to that gas station, or what was left of it. The place was exactly how the waitress had described it, burned to the ground. Blackened beams jutted out from the wreckage like broken ribs. The old neon sign lay shattered on the ground. No one had worked here in over a year. So who the hell had I talked to that night? I walked around the perimeter, kicking through the ashes, until I spotted something near the edge of the lot. Tire tracks, fresh ones. Someone had been here, recently, and then half buried in the dirt, I found it. A wad of gum, still pink, still sticky. My stomach twisted. She had been here. She was real. I took my search to the police. At first, they thought I was crazy. But when I mentioned the gas station and the waitress's story, one of the older officers, Deputy Morris, perked up. You said a girl with dark hair? Early 20s? Yeah, I said, pulse quickening. You know her? He exhaled, rubbing his jaw. There was a girl, Carla Matthews. She worked here back before the fire, but she wasn't exactly an employee. I frowned. What do you mean? Morris hesitated, then said she ran scams, acted all friendly, got guys to tell her where they were heading. Then her boyfriend, Mark, I think, would follow them, rob them. Sometimes worse. I went cold. Worse? Morris nodded grimly. They found a guy's body in a ditch a few towns over. Mark disappeared after that, but people say Carla kept running the con, alone. My mouth went dry. And the fire, I asked. Morris shrugged. No one knows how it started. Maybe an accident. Maybe someone got even. A shiver crawled down my spine. She was still out there, and I had barely escaped her game. That night, I slept with a baseball bat next to my bed. I half expected to wake up to the sound of a car outside, headlights shining through my window. But nothing happened. A few more weeks passed, then a few months, and just like that, she was gone. Maybe she moved on. Maybe she found someone else to hunt. But me, I learned my lesson. No more late-night gas stations, no more long, empty highways, and no more ignoring the feeling in my gut when something doesn't feel right. Because sometimes, the scariest people aren't the ones lurking in shadows. They're the ones smiling at you from across the counter. And if I had said the wrong thing that night, if I had let my guard down just a little more, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I was 17 in the summer of '96, working late nights at a video rental store on the outskirts of town. It was a dead-end job, but I didn't mind. Free rentals, a quiet shift, and an old TV in the corner playing whatever I wanted. It was the kind of place where time felt slow, where nothing ever really happened, until that night. We closed at midnight, but I usually stuck around a little longer to clean up. That night, I was alone, sweeping popcorn off the worn-out carpet when the bell over the door jingled. Strange, I'd flipped the sign to closed. A man stood in the doorway, backlit by the buzzing neon lights outside. He was tall, maybe in his late 30s, wearing a black windbreaker zipped up despite the summer heat. His face was pale and stretched thin, like he hadn't slept in weeks. Hey, sorry, we're closed, I called out, my voice casual, but my gut already uneasy. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me. Then, slowly, he stepped inside and let the door swing shut behind him. "I just need one movie," he said finally. His voice was flat, hollow. "Won't take long." I hesitated. The register was already closed, and I didn't want to deal with some weirdo at this hour, but something in his stare made it feel easier to just get this over with. "All right," I muttered. "Real quick." He walked straight to the new releases wall, dragging his fingers along the plastic cases, not really looking at them. The store was silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint sound of an old X-Files episode playing on the TV behind the counter. "You work here alone?" he asked without looking at me. I didn't like that. "My manager's in the back," I lied, "doing inventory." He nodded slowly, as if he knew I was lying. Then he picked up a random movie, Twister, and walked toward the counter. I rang him up quickly, pushing the receipt across the counter without making eye contact. His fingers brushed mine as he took it. Ice cold. "You need a ride home?" he asked suddenly. I looked up. His eyes weren't just tired, they were empty, like he was waiting for me to say yes. "Nah, I'm good," I said, forcing a chuckle. "Got my own ride." My car was in the shop, and I was planning to walk home like I always did. He didn't move, just kept staring. "Long walk at this hour," he murmured. I swallowed hard, pretending to check the clock. "Yeah, well, I should lock up." The man finally gave a slow nod, as if he'd made up his mind about something. Then he turned, stepping out into the night. I exhaled, my pulse still hammering in my ears. I locked the door fast. Through the glass, I watched as he walked past the parking lot and toward the street. For a second, I thought that was the end of it, but then he stopped, and he turned around. I saw the reflection of neon lights on something small and metallic in his hand. A car key. He wasn't walking home. He was waiting. I killed the store lights, heart pounding. From the darkness, I watched him. He leaned against a light pole, just standing there, turning the keys over in his fingers, waiting for me. I waited too. 10 minutes, then 20. The store was completely dark, and I prayed he thought I had a ride after all. Finally, after what felt like forever, he walked away. Got into a dark sedan parked across the street and drove off. I waited another hour before stepping outside. The air was still thick and humid. The street was empty. But as I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd see that car again. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way home, expecting to see the glare of his headlights creeping up behind me. But the streets stayed dark, silent. By the time I reached my house, my skin was slick with sweat, not just from the summer heat, but from pure stomach-knotting fear. I locked the door behind me, checked it twice, and then peered through the blinds at the empty street. Maybe he was gone. Maybe I'd imagined how bad it was. But deep down, I knew better. I barely slept that night, and when my shift rolled around the next evening, I almost called in sick. But I didn't. I needed the money, and I told myself he was probably just some creepy guy passing through town. Still, when I got to work, I checked every corner of the parking lot. No dark sedan, no sign of him. For the first few hours, it was a normal shift. A couple of regulars, a mom renting a stack of Disney movies, some teens trying to talk me into letting them rent Scream. By the time the clock hit 11:30, I was starting to feel stupid for being so paranoid. Then, just as I was about to lock up, the phone rang. "Video Haven," I said automatically. Silence. Then a familiar voice. "Still don't need that ride home?" My stomach turned to ice. I slammed the phone down and locked the door so fast my hands shook. My heart pounded as I backed away from the counter. I didn't know how he got the store's number, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the faint glow of headlights across the parking lot. He was here. I grabbed the store phone and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. The operator's voice was calm, but I could barely breathe enough to speak. "There's a man outside my work," I whispered. "I think he's been following me." "Where are you now?" I'm inside. The doors are locked, but he knows I'm here." She told me to stay put, that an officer was on the way. But outside, the sedan's headlights shut off. A car door opened. I dropped to the floor behind the counter, heart hammering. Through the reflection in the glass, I saw him walking toward the store. Slow, like he had all the time in the world. The door handle rattled. I covered my mouth to keep from making a sound. Then, a burst of flashing red and blue lights cut through the night. A siren. The man froze. I heard the voice of a cop barking orders, saw him hesitate for just a second, then bolt. He took off toward the street, his car abandoned as two officers jumped out, chasing after him. I stayed frozen behind the counter, barely able to breathe until one of the officers knocked on the glass. "It's safe now," he said. "We got him." I don't remember much after that, just answering questions, giving a description, and hearing words like repeat offender and escalating behavior. Apparently, he'd been seen lurking outside other businesses, following women home. But this time, they caught him. I quit that job the next morning. A few weeks later, I got a call from the police. They told me he was in custody and wouldn't be getting out anytime soon. That night, for the first time in weeks, I finally slept. The summer of '96 was the scariest time of my life, but I learned something important. Always trust your gut. Always. If something feels off, don't ignore it. Because sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones in horror movies. Sometimes they're the ones watching, waiting, and sometimes you get away just in time. It was supposed to be the last weekend before winter break, a retreat, the perfect escape from school before the holidays. The school had this annual tradition of sending kids to a remote winter camp. I didn't care much for the idea, but my friends had all signed up, so I followed along. Camp was tucked away in the middle of nowhere, long, winding roads surrounded by nothing but trees, snow, and a hauntingly quiet lake. The kind of place where if something went wrong, you'd have no help for miles. Of course, back then, the idea of being off the grid didn't seem all that bad. No one needed cell phones in the '90s. We had walkie-talkies, but that was about it. When we arrived, I could already tell something was off. The camp looked like something out of a horror movie. The cabins were old and run down, the paint peeling, the windows grimy from years of neglect. The counselors were too cheerful, the kind of unnerving cheerfulness that made your skin crawl. They gave us a quick tour, handed out our schedules, and sent us off to our cabins. But the kids, especially the ones in my group, were awful. They were the type to stir up trouble just because they could. Timmy, the loudest of the bunch, was already causing a scene by throwing snowballs at a cabin and yelling obscenities at the counselors. A few of the others were snickering in the background, egging him on. I was stuck in the middle of it all, trying to blend in without getting dragged into trouble. But Timmy had a knack for making anyone around him miserable. That first night, after the forced bonding activities, we were all crammed into our cabins. It was freezing cold, and the only source of warmth was a small space heater in the corner. The walls were paper thin, and you could hear every creak, every whisper, every laugh from the other rooms. The kids were restless, talking and giggling well into the night. Timmy was the worst, loud and obnoxious, mocking the counselors and making fun of the camp. I got up to check on the other cabins. I knocked on Timmy's door, but no one answered. I could hear faint sounds from inside, muffled voices, some movement. I knocked again, but nothing. I turned the handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it opened with a creak. The cabin was empty. The beds were neatly made, everything looked untouched. But the weirdest thing was the window, wide open, the snow drifting in, coating the sill. I frowned. I had definitely heard voices. What the hell was going on? I quickly left and checked the next cabin. Same thing. The kids were gone, their beds were made, and the room was eerily quiet. But this time I heard a shuffle behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there, just the snow falling heavily outside. The feeling in my gut twisted, but I couldn't figure out what was happening. Maybe it was some prank. Maybe they were hiding in the trees, trying to scare me. But something about the silence, the absolute silence, felt wrong. I went to the main lodge, hoping to find someone. It was locked. The lights were off. I pounded on the door, but there was no answer. There was a strange tension in the air, a growing sense of unease. No one was around. It felt like the camp had suddenly gone empty. Then I heard the first shout. Timmy, I recognized his voice. It echoed from the woods, distant but frantic. Another scream, followed by more shouts, more voices. It sounded like a group, but it wasn't making sense. Were they all lost? How had they disappeared so quickly? I ran toward the sound, ignoring the cold, ignoring the blizzard that had started to pick up. As I reached the edge of the woods, I finally saw them. The kids were standing in a circle around the campfire, staring at something in the middle. They were completely silent now, just watching. As I approached, Timmy turned around, his face pale, eyes wide. He was shaking. "They're gone," he muttered. "What do you mean? Who's gone?" I asked. "The counselors. They were here, but now they're not. It's like they vanished." I looked around, but the camp was empty. Counselors were nowhere to be seen, not a single one. The camp felt abandoned, like no one had ever been there. I turned to Timmy, trying to make sense of it. "Where did everyone go?" Timmy just shook his head. He didn't know. No one knew. The kids had scattered, searching for the adults, calling out, but there was no answer. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a joke. By morning, the snowstorm had worsened. We tried to head back to town, but the roads were impassable. We had no way to contact anyone. No phones, no radios, nothing. We were stranded, left to fend for ourselves in a deserted camp with no sign of life. It took 2 days before we were found by a group of hikers who had ventured through the woods. They reported no signs of anyone. The abandoned camp, the eerie quiet. The camp had been shut down for good after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. To this day, I have no idea what happened to those counselors or how we ended up alone. Maybe the kids never really left. Maybe we didn't either. But we were all changed after that weekend. And every winter, when the snow starts to fall, I can't help but remember the camp and the whispers of something watching from the woods.